What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and we are doing yet another video about the April 1st, 2020 sort of ruling change for both the TCG and the OCG formats. And I know a lot of people call it Master Rule 5. I'll probably put that in the title, but also I'm aware that it's not the official name. The fact of the matter is that for the most amount of people to find this video about the topic that they're looking for, Master Rule 5 is just the most widely accepted terminology for the current rule change. The last few videos that I made about this topic were mostly about cards or decks that were buffed specifically by this ruling change, and that was really fun. But I want to talk about a couple cards, and trust me, there are only a few of them. It's only a top 5 video, but I want to talk about some cards that actually get worse with this new ruling change. Now, like I said, this was difficult to come up with this list because in general this Master Rule just helps out a bunch of strategies. Compared to the last couple videos that I've made about Master Rule 5, this one is going to have less restrictions because there just aren't as many cards affected by this ruling change. For example, this list is actually going to include some archetype cards. They're not all archetype cards, but a couple of them are. And also this list only includes cards that are sort of indirectly affected by Master Rule 5. I'm not actually sure if there's any cards that are directly sort of negatively affected by the ruling change. So these cards are going to be less popular or less powerful depending on the metagame shifts as well as the extra deck shifts come April 1st. First up, I want to give an honorable mention to Topologic Bomber Dragon. And why is this an honorable mention? Well, a lot of players out there, myself included, can't actually sort of come to the same conclusion on whether or not this card is buffed or nerfed by this Master Rule change. How is that so? Well, on the one hand, if you want to say it's buffed because more people will be summoning things to the main monster zone now that you no longer have to use the extra monster zone for synchros, fusion, and exceeds monsters. On the other hand, this card might be nerfed because one of the great benefits of Topologic Bomber Dragon is that it sort of limited what your opponent could do with their own link summons and link arrows, because if they summon things to where their link monsters pointed to, you would just blow up all the main monster zone cards. So you can kind of see here how it's good and bad. So I'm not really sure if it gets buffed or nerfed or maybe both, but I will mention it as an honorable mention because I probably should have mentioned it in one of the 2 previous videos about Master Rule 5. First up, we have the MEC Night Monsters, and yes, I will include all of these as just one entry on this list. A lot of the best ones, I'm pretty sure like all of them, but I know the best ones like purple and blue require 2 cards to be in the exact same column to special summon them for free from your hand. And while players will certainly still summon cards to the same column as their back rows in some scenarios, I think one of the biggest benefits of Mecha Knights that is now lost is that you almost always could count on a monster being in the extra monster zone. It was especially useful with blue because blue gets searches based on how many cards your opponent controls in the same column. So now that your opponent might not always have 2 cards, like an extra monster zone card and then a spell or trap card or a monster card below it, it might be harder to get more than one search off of the blue effect because oftentimes you'll be setting the second card in whatever column you need to summon it. So in general, while the Mecha Knights haven't been the most competitive over the past couple months, I mean, they had a couple really big showings, but in general, you don't expect a lot of Mecha Knights at current tournaments. They certainly have been very successful in the past. They have some really powerful cards like blue and purple. They can put free bodies on the board for link summons, and in general, they still are a very good archetype, but this Master Ruling change actually does negatively affect them in quite a big way just by taking away the extra monster zone being pretty much always a guaranteed zone that your opponent will have a monster card in. Will Mecha Knights go away forever? I mean, probably not. That seems pretty unlikely. It still is a really good archetype, but I think that they will fall in popularity even more so than they have fallen right now. So even if they're not terrible or unplayable going forward, they certainly are nerfed compared to right now. Next up, we have Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, and I want to say that I almost didn't include this one on the main list, so it's just going to be an honorable mention because I really feel like people are greatly underestimating how good this card will be even after the April 1st, 2020 Master Rule change. And I say that because it seems like some discussions out there are making it sound like, okay, there are no link monsters anymore come April. Everyone's just going to drop them from their decks, which I really don't think is true. Yes, certainly people will just in general play less link monsters, especially if the decks that are mainly synchro focused or exceeds focused or fusion focused, but even those decks will probably want to play a link monster like Nightmare Phoenix perhaps, or Link Kribo is a really popular one. There are good link monsters out there that people will still play in those synchro, fusion, or exceeds heavy strategies. Make no mistake, link monsters are still going to be all over the place. They're still probably going to be the most popular, the most consistently used extra deck monster type because even at this point, even if you don't have to use the extra monster zone or link arrows for fusion fusion, exceeds, and synchro monsters, there are just a bunch of really powerful link monsters that a lot of people are still going to want to play. Maybe you're playing really specific cards like Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite in your Pendulum deck, a deck that would probably use a lot of synchros and exceeds and cards like that. If you're playing a synchro strategy, sure, you want to play a lot of synchros, that makes sense, and TG Hyper Librarian gets insane under this new ruling change, but you probably also want to play Crystron Needle Fiber, which I know it has a different name now, but I don't know how to pronounce it at all, so I'm just going to call it Needle Fiber. That comes out 2 weeks before this Master Rule change, so pretty much everyone playing a synchro deck is going to want to have at least 1 or 2 copies of that in their extra deck, which is, of course, a link monster. Certainly, link monsters are going to go down in popularity as more and more people sort of experiment with non-link summoning decks or decks that don't play a lot of link monsters, but they will still be all over the place. It's not like Sky Strikers and Salamangreats and all of these decks out there like Orcus are just going to go away overnight. Sure, if those decks get slaughtered on the next ban list and then a whole bunch of other link cards get slaughtered on the ban list as well, maybe in that case link monsters are so unpopular that Fantastical Dragon Phantasme completely goes out of the metagame. I really doubt that's going to happen though, and I think people are really undervaluing Phantasme come in April. Now maybe its price has dropped not only because of this, but because people are feeling like it'll eventually get a reprint, which certainly it will someday, but I don't know how quickly that's going to happen. But yes, I understand that the card is going to be worse, but just because a card is worse does not mean it's bad or unplayable. Fantastical Dragon Phantasme is likely still going to be a very common card you see at the top cut of tournaments. Of course, I can try to future-proof this video a little bit and say that, kind of like I said a couple minutes ago, that yes, if Konami just guts every single good link monster on the ban list or on several ban lists, then maybe Phantasme isn't as good anymore. But if you just like put the ruling change right now, like today, and then made it sort of that everyone was playing synchros and fusions and exceed monsters, you can still see that Phantasme would be super powerful in the format. So it'll take at least 1 or 2 ban lists to really kill or really hurt all these link summoning decks. And even if they do that, there are so many good generic link monsters that Fantastical Dragon Phantasme seems like it'll still be a mainstay in competition for quite a while. And then we have Chimera Tech Mega Fleet Dragon, which yes, was played in pure Cyber Dragon decks and still is, and was played, and I guess is still played if people are using that deck, but the Cyber Dragon Orcus deck really like this card a lot. And this card, I mean, not only was it played in those decks, but it was played just as a generic piece of removal in any deck that wanted to side deck a couple copies of Cyber Dragon. I myself even did that at a couple tournaments, and it was really powerful. The main problem with this card is pretty clear, but the material for it is 1 Cyber Dragon monster plus 1 or more monsters in the extra monster zone. Now, if less people are using the extra monster zone, or if less people are actually summoning things there and then leaving them there for you to take away with this card, then yes, it loses a lot of its strength. And this is a real shame because I think that having a card like this is really important for Yu-Gi-Oh! I think having a way to like out an extra link, which pretty much doesn't exist anymore, because why would you do that? I mean, yeah, I guess it stops link summoning, but it doesn't stop like fusion, synchro, and exceeds monsters anymore. But besides the point, I think that having a card like this kind of was like a super poly, but a super poly you didn't have to draw all the time. You know, it was one of the things that kept the Cyber Dragon Orcus deck in check. If you just included 1 copy of this in your extra deck, you could use their Infinity and their Dengirsu to summon this. Pure Cyber Dragons have plenty of other good cards, but this certainly does take them down a notch in terms of how competitively viable they are. They have seen many tops over the past couple years. They have received more and more support, but Mega Fleet was definitely a huge selling point to playing Cyber Dragons or just playing Cyber Dragon in your side deck to out your opponent's cards, and now it'll certainly become a lot worse, so I'm not really sure how many pure Cyber Dragon decks we'll see after April 2020. And what about No Material? Now, this is a card that was made, in my mind, almost exclusively to prevent Nightmare Mermaid from being summoned, and oh man, was it good in that role. Basically, your opponent would summon Nightmare Phoenix or Nightmare Cerberus, then you would use the No Material to lock them out of that card being used as material, which, because you could only have 1 monster in the extra monster zone, it meant that you were locked out of summoning from the extra deck for basically the rest of that turn. That was extremely viable against Orcus. It was super popular for about 1 format there, so several months, and then with this change, it basically becomes useless. Now, No Material right now is not seeing a ton of play. I mean, don't get me wrong, the card is very good, but you don't have Nightmare Mermaid anymore, so the card has sort of fallen out of favor. Before Nightmare Mermaid got banned, though, people would still play this card against other matchups. You could lock down the Guard Dragon deck sometimes if you hit the right monster card. You could play it against Salad sometimes if you hit the right monster card, but I really think this card becomes borderline unplayable with the new Master Rule, and certainly it has been used against against cards that weren't Link monsters. It's particularly good against the Outer Entity combo because, once again, you can lock your opponent out of their extra monster zone, but that doesn't seem to matter as much anymore because they can just summon their Xyz and Synchros and Fusion monsters to their main monster zone. No Material certainly took a big hit with this latest ban list, with Mermaid getting banned. I think with this latest rule change, it will make it pretty hard for this card to see competitive play unless a very specific Link monster is released for an archetype that only plays Links. Next up, we have a card that hasn't been used that much, but I know some players like it a lot, and it really has been one of the most hit cards from this new Master Rule, despite already not being that competitive. Now, why is this card hit? Well, it was almost exclusively used on columns, the 2 extra Monster Zone columns, and that's pretty much all it was good for. You blew up some cards, sure, but also you locked down that column while it was face up on the field. Now, why did that matter? Well, it mattered because not only did you lock your opponent out of one column for their monster card and their spell and trap card, but also you could cut them out of an extra monster zone, and then you could use the other one so they could never use that extra monster zone while this thing was on the field. Now that your opponent doesn't have to use the extra monster zone for their Fusion, Xyz, and Synchro monsters, this card basically looks really bad, and even though it wasn't the most competitive card already, I think this really is the final nail in the coffin. It's going to be really tough for this card to ever see competitive play under this new Master Rule, which is a real shame because the card's design is actually really cool. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on these 5 cards nerfed by Master Rule 5. Like I said at the beginning, or like I implied at the beginning, I will not be doing a 5 decks or 10 decks nerfed by Master Rule 5. It really seems like most often decks are either just staying the same or getting boosted by this ruling change. There's only a couple cards, only a couple decks out there like MEC Knights that truly get negatively affected by this change. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.